Who wants to hear a story about a product that's price has actually gone back down to pre-COVID prices while its quality has improved? This is the 2024 Giant Fathom 29.2. Hey bike geeks, from weight to wheels, price to performance, we're here to take a close look at bicycles so you can make an educated decision when selecting your next bike. In today's video, we're having a look at the brand new 2024 Giant Fathom 29.2. Coming up with more details, close-ups, and discussion of this bike. So this new 2024 Giant Fathom 29.2 is one of 4 different Fathoms in the Giant lineup. There's a Fathom 29.2, Fathom 29.1, and then there's also a 27.5-inch wheeled version of each of those. Between the different wheel sizes, the bike is pretty much the same with the exception of wheel size. So it's sort of 4 models, sort of 2 models. This particular one, the Fathom 29.2, it is the first price point, and it is $16.99 in Canada. They haven't even released this one in the States yet, but the last version that they show of this, which is sort of the last spec, not this spec, is on sale, I think, in the States at $1,500. So I imagine when they kind of catch up to Canada in the States, this will probably end up being maybe a $1,300 or a $1,400 bike in the States. So a very, very impressive price to start with. Now, I'm going to sort of discuss a couple things here, just so at first, a lot of people I see when I look at the statistics or the analytics on our videos, they want to get the first few tidbits of information, the main stuff, and then they tune out. So rather than being one of those channels that's going to make you hold on for some garbage 20 minutes later, I'll give you the garbage now, and then if you want to listen to me yammering on about bikes, well, I'm here for you for a while. So the standout thing, this is a trail bike. And by trail bike, I mean this bike has a head tube angle that is slacker than things like a Giant Talon or a lot of the other sort of entry-level mountain bikes. Also the seat tube angle, the angle of that tube there is a little bit steeper. The frame itself is a little bit longer, and that is all designed around working with quite a short stem. All of those things, as far as the frame is concerned, add up to being a trail bike. Other things that add up to that are things like this fork, which has 130 millimeters of travel. That is how much the fork can actually move there. The fact that we've got some really wide rims on here and relatively wide tires that are set up tubeless. These are all things, so between the geometry of the frame, between the bits and pieces that are touching the ground, touching your hand, touching your butt, everything on this bike is aimed at actual mountain biking, not at giving you a bike that when you look at it hanging in your garage, you can say, I've got a mountain bike, but when you go mountain biking on it, it's kind of terrifying or not confidence inspiring. This is taking cues from what's happening at the high end, where people are spending more money than this complete bike just to get a frame, and they're building it up. So this is a real bike if you want to get into riding mountain bikes and your budget is either a limitation or the fact that you're purposely avoiding having a rear boingy boingy squishy bit. You want a hardtail. This is an excellent way to go. Now, a standout part of that whole thing is the fact that this is only 30.5 pounds in this configuration. This is a size medium, 29, with big tires on it. So that is probably a better weight than anything cheaper, and certainly a better weight than a lot of the competitors, or any competitor I know of that is roughly in this price point. So that is a big thing to keep in mind. Now, bikes that are often compared to this are things like Trek Roscoe. I think it's maybe the 6. The 6 looks like it's maybe a touch cheaper, but it has a couple things that I would say are serious downgrades in comparison to this. And this isn't the usual order of things that I do in a video, but just to give you the highlights, a lot of people will be having a quick look at this, trying to make a buying decision. On a Trek Roscoe, you're going to have a steel stanchion Suntour fork. So this bit that goes down inside the fork is going to be steel, not alloy. It may be an air sprung, although I'm not sure. It might just be coil sprung with steel up inside the frame there. So you're going to add on probably a couple pounds of extra weight just in the front of your bike. That's going to basically affect how maneuverable your bike is as you're sort of going through stuff and needing to lift your front wheel. It probably also won't give you as much sophistication in the tunability of the fork. So that's a big thing, the weight and that fork. These tires being set up tubeless, that matters a lot. This geometry is an awesome all-around geometry. And the other thing then, comparing this new Fathom to that Trek Roscoe 6, is the fact that we are looking at the new Shimano Q's 10-speed drivetrain in this case. So that 10-speed means that we have 10 different gears on this cassette back here. Our range of gears goes from 11 to 48 teeth. The 9-speed, which is on something like a Trek Roscoe, doesn't have as broad a range of gears on here. It's of course only got 9 speeds. It also won't have a clutch, which is this little thingy on the derailleur, which is basically making this very, very similar to a Dior level derailleur. And that clutch when it's on means you have a really, really strong spring here. And that is helping to keep tension in your chain, telling you that this thing is truly designed for mountain biking. The 9-speed version I think is more akin to the previous Shimano group sets of either a Serra or a Livio, which is a little bit more of sort of a street riding temporary mountain bike sort of a drivetrain, where this is fully ready to go. We even have proper narrow wide chain rings on here with these new Shimano Q's cranks. So this is a bit of an upgrade from last year, where this bike would have had Praxis for cranks, and the drivetrain would have been a 10-speed Dior last year. The 10-speed Dior and this, as I sort of mentioned, are very, very similar in their functioning quality. One of the nice things with this Shimano Q's stuff is it is using Shimano's new Link drive, which is basically a combination of the way that things back here are designed as far as the actual designing of the teeth, the thickness of the teeth, same thing up here, and then the chain that they use, which is supposed to extend the expected lifespan of these drivetrains pretty significantly, like double the lifespan of the equivalent Dior drivetrain. So there is a pretty noticeable improvement in quality that maybe at first you won't really notice much, but the fact that maybe in 2 years, where you are not having to replace a new drivetrain even after, say, a couple good years of riding, you'll be very happy that you would have gotten this Shimano Q's drivetrain. One other thing to mention as we talk about that Roscoe as a comparison, it will have FSA cranks with a square taper bottom bracket, where this is taking much more of a lead from the performance level mountain bike stuff in the Shimano lineup, with external threaded bottom bracket as well as a 2-piece crankset. That 2-piece crankset means that we have a thicker spindle, and we also have a little bit more mechanically sound sort of a way of attaching the cranks onto the spindle in there, if that makes any sense. So there's the very quick thing about this compared to a Roscoe. I would also mention the specialized fuse, but it is so much more expensive that it almost doesn't even compare to the Fathom 1, the model above this. As I mentioned, this one's $16.99 in Canada, or anticipated to be, say, $1,300 or $1,400 in the States, if it ever gets down there. The States is suffering after COVID with a little bit more extra bikes in their warehouses down there. So the story is, through the rumor mill at least, that their buyers are not allowed to buy things unless they sell out of the previous year's stuff, whereas in Canada we have been lucky enough to basically work through product quite quickly. And speaking of that, in some bikes I would say that there are going to be expected shortages as soon as this summer, because Giant is not the only company that is going to be quite shy with how many bikes they're bringing in certain categories. And I think we're going to go from an abundance and you've probably seen sale prices on some bikes. This is going to change quite quickly, so yeah, don't get used to the sale prices. Maybe take advantage of the fact that I think Giant is trying really hard to get prices back to pre-COVID sort of numbers, and I think that that's what we're seeing basically on this bike. If I remember correctly, the 2019, the last sort of pre-COVID price on something like this would have been, say, $15.99 and maybe $16.99. I don't recall exactly. So now I can at least go through some of the details with you about this bike. If you've hung out this long, you may as well subscribe and press the like button because you're obviously a bike nerd like I am. If this is the first time tuning into this channel, my name is Graham and our shop is Bike Bros. We're in Cochrane, Alberta, Canada. We are Giant, Marin, Rocky Mountain and Pivot dealers. We have won, I think we're on about 13 awards for Best Bike Shop in Canada now. And all those awards are voted in by customers, and I would like to think that that's because, not because we pay those customers to say or to vote, but because we try really, really hard to sell products that we're proud of and then to match the right product with the rider. And so this is a case where if somebody comes in and they say, hey, I really want to get into mountain biking, I can't afford to spend say $2,200 on a full suspension bike that has a dropper seat post, or I really enjoy riding hardtails, what will you recommend? This is going to be a standout here. From other companies that we carry, bikes that compare quite well to this or are sort of in this aggressive trail hardtail are things like the Rocky Mountain Growler and the Marin San Quentin 29 especially. I do group them a bit differently though, because in each of those cases they suit a rider that really wants to be aggressive and ride like a bit of a moron. In this case, I would say this is for a rider who wants the confidence of having a proper modern geometry, but it isn't all about descending for them and isn't all about buying just a complete brick house of a bike that is very heavy. This is a much more sophisticated take on the aggressive trail hardtail. So I just want to highlight that this is a light bike in the neighborhood of 3, 4, probably up to 6 or 7 pounds lighter than some of the comparable aggressive hardtails. Yet things like that head tube angle are still slack enough that I think that it's going to give all the right feedback to a rider and to help a rider learn sort of the modern way of riding a mountain bike. So we'll quickly get into some details then here. Starting at the back of the bike, we're looking at tubeless setup, not just tubeless ready, but tubeless setup. So there's actually sealant inside these tires, and that is provided by Giant for us. These are Maxxis Aggressors, which are a pretty popular rear tire, although I find them to be maybe a little bit skiddy, but skidding and hardtail sort of goes together as a really fun way to ride a bike. So tubeless 29 by 2.5 Aggressors. They're on EXO casing, and that EXO casing is a casing that's designed to give you a relatively supple, not hugely protective layer, preventing you from getting flats, but I still think quite appropriate for something in this sort of a category. The frame has a through axle on there. I hope that there's nothing in this price point anymore that's calling itself a proper hardtail mountain bike that's still using a traditional quick release to hold the rear wheel on. But that is something, if you're not aware, through axles, basically it just means that you're taking your frame, the axle that's going through there, joining the wheel to the frame, is acting as basically a structural enforcement to sort of hold that whole system together, not just a thing that stops your wheel from falling off. Looking at the backside of the chainstay here, if you can read that with the glare of my lights, that says Alex SL. And so that brings up the fact that part of the reason that this bike can be so light is that Giant is the world's biggest bike manufacturer, and they don't just manufacture the bike out of pre-bought tubes. They go as far as actually doing the smelting of the alloy And that means that they can make some very fancy, strong and light alloys that they will use on their own bikes. And when we see Alex SL on a frame, we know that we're going to be looking at a pretty sophisticated, lightweight version of aluminum, because not all aluminum alloys are the same for strength to weight ratio. Heading a little bit forward, actually we can just show you the fact that these seat stays are quite slim. So what they're thinking about here is if we can make this relatively slim, the rear end of the bike is not going to be like suspension at all, but it does help to just give a little bit of vibration dampening to the rear wheel, so you don't get quite as much of that sort of fine vibration transmitted up into your hands or up into your butt. Speaking of your butt, it's the Giant Romero saddle. This is one of my favorite. It is a really nice OEM or stock saddle on a bike. It is attached to a pretty simple dropper, 125 millimeters of drop, and I think that's on all sizes as far as I can tell. This particular bike we're looking at a medium and it's using a 125. I don't think I've pulled a large or an extra large out of a box yet this year, as this is pretty new to us getting this bike. So I mean, if I had to criticize, I would say if Giant really wanted to be on the ball, that thing should have maybe been a 175 dropper on this medium and gone up to say a 180 or a 200, something like that on a large. But I'm not going to criticize because it still gives enough drop that you can really get the benefits of a dropper on this bike. A weird thing that Giant insists on doing is putting a quick release on some of their bikes that also has a dropper post. That to me seems like it doesn't make any sense really, but whatever. We do at least see that they are not putting any kind of water bottle mounts on the seat tube here. That's a good thing, because that means that we have all that room that your dropper post can actually go into the frame and not be limited by a bolt sticking through. We get 3 positions for the down tube bottle mount. That just means you could mount it down lower, down here, or using these bolts. We also get what would typically be called sort of a cargo cage kind of a thing up here. But on a big enough frame with a good enough bottle cage, you might be able to get a bottle there. And then in the cow poo zone down here, if you wanted to put something down here to collect cow poo on your trail, you could put your bottle down here and have nicely flavored water. That also gives you a nice view of that Giant deckling. So they are planning on this thing being jumped over somebody's head so that you can notice the Giant branding on there. This also shows off the fact that we've got the internal cable routing. Nothing exciting about that anymore at this price point, because that's just a pretty average thing. I didn't sort of talk about it by the fact this is called Starry Night or something like that, I think, this particular color. There is a second color of this. I would just call it root beer, but it's also actually got an official name called Pyrite Brown. I quite like the detail, both of the fact that this is glossy. There's some sparkle in this paint, and then it's got this sort of dark mustard color on the top tube and on the top of the seat stays. It looks pretty nice. Looking at things like the stem on here, depending on the size of the bike, you have either, I believe, a 40 or a 50 mil stem. It's got a 35 millimeter clamp area, so it is a modern sort of a standard for handlebars. These alloy bars that Giant uses are 780 millimeters wide, and they have a pretty normal bend and sweep to them. One thing I would mention is if you look at how short that head tube is, so just that distance there, it's a pretty short head tube on this bike. So for some people, if you happen to be really long-legged, you might want to be upgrading your handlebars to a higher rise handlebar. And while you're at it, these grips are garbage. I find them to be uncomfortable. They're also not clamp-on, so it doesn't take too much to get dirt underneath, and next thing you know, you're getting throttle grip and all sorts of stuff. So this, I would say, of everything on the bike, that is about the only thing I would say is, well, I would say it's a must to upgrade. Some people would say I'm picky, but there's that. For some people who are starting to ride this bike really to its limit, would maybe be looking at a longer dropper post. And other than that, I think tires are good. These rims that are holding the tires are 30 millimeters wide, so they help you to get really good performance out of your Maxxis tires. And as we go back to that, the front is a Minion DHF, DHF standing for, this is the front tire, also in a 2.5 width, so we have aggressor on the back, DHF on the front, a very standard sort of a setup that people would actually pay money for aftermarket to put on their bikes. This fork is 130 millimeters of travel, as I mentioned. Stanchions are 34 millimeters, so that is 34 is the same as a Fox 34. So in the Fox's names, that's how they name them, and at about 120 or 130 is where Fox seems to think that a 34 millimeter is a perfectly appropriate stanchion size. So I think that Giant can't be too far off the mark on this Giant Crest fork. This fork is an actual in-house Giant design, so that is where they're able to do the alloy stanchions here, alloy tapered steer tube here, save you a bunch of money. This thing actually works reasonably well. It is an air fork, so under that cap there, you actually have an air valve that you need a shock pump for, but you can set your suspension to work exactly for you. You've got, on this side here, you have, I think, 4 different clicks over here, which is different levels of compression damping, or for people who don't know what damping is, that's basically sort of marginal increases in the stiffness of the fork. When you go all the way back like that, you essentially have a locked out fork. When you're setting this thing up, what you will do is you're going to set up your air pressure in here first. Once you get that right, you need to make sure that this thing doesn't feel like an uncontrolled pogo stick. And to do that means, first step, going down to your rebound knob down here and adjusting that so that your air pressure is set first, rebound set second, and that is essentially going to give you a fork that is actually a suspension fork, not a wheel-mounted pogo stick. So what else do you want to know about this bike? Head angle, 66 degrees, seat angle, 75 degrees. I think these are perfectly awesome angles. I would consider, quite honestly, building one of these up and making it a high-end bike, because I bet if you concentrated on doing some fancy parts on here, you could probably get this thing down to 26 pounds and it would be an awesome bike, because it is perfectly appropriate geometry and quality wise to take that silly step. Oh, I didn't touch on this. The brakes. So the brakes on this guy are Tektro hydraulics. Nothing fancy, but Tektros are at least proven, not the highest of performance, but they are pretty reliable. They feel a little bit blocky, and by blocky I mean you kind of have like free stroke and then just a very solid stop to it. So modulation, not a great thing, but they work. They share Shimano brake pads that go inside here. So if you wanted to use different compounds in your brake pads, you do at least have that ability down there. And you could potentially even, if you wanted more braking power, you could maybe even go up rotor size on your brakes here. So, and I think these are 180s on here, but I honestly didn't look at that part of the spec, but I think that's what they look like. This is just showing the bike from the other side here. There's that Q's, that hollow spindle there is your sign that we're looking at. A 2-piece crankset. The fact that you're seeing all of that stuff there is showing that you've got external mounted thread-in bottom bracket bearings. And this is what a Giant Fathom 29.2 looks like in 2024. What do you think? Would you consider it? Have I talked you out of getting a Trek Roscoe? Yeah, great bike. Give us any feedback if you have questions about the bike. I like to pay attention to the comments, and I will answer things if I can make sense of the question. And this has been a 2024 Giant Fathom 29.2, and maybe one of the next videos I'll do is going to be on a Fathom 1, but I don't know. We'll see you again soon. Bye.